Welcome to Storytime in Hubbleville. Today we're reading Thurston T. Turtle Moves to Hubbleville, Chapter 6. Missed Again. Just as Mr. Squirrel closed his front door, Mr. Possum turned the corner onto Oak Street. "Oh, I do hope that Thurgood C. Turtle fellow is still somewhere around the old house," he mumbled to himself as he approached house number 123. Mr. Possum did not see anyone as he walked up the sidewalk toward the front porch. "Hello?" he called. Is anyone here?" No one answered, so Mr. Possum began to search around the house. While Mr. Possum was busy checking the backyard, Mr. Turtle stepped out of Mr. Squirrel's house. "I'm sorry I can't stay longer," Mr. Turtle explained as they stood on the front porch. "I just have so much to do today." "I certainly understand, Mr. Turtle, but please do join my wife and me for supper tonight. Mrs. Squirrel and I make a delicious stew," Mr. Squirrel insisted. "Thank you very much," replied Mr. Turtle. "I'd love to join you and your wife for supper, and thank you for the lemonade. It was delicious. And the stories were wonderful. I hope there are plenty more of both." Mr. Turtle shook hands with Mr. Squirrel once again, and then left to take care of his important business. About 10 minutes later, Mr. Squirrel heard a knock on his front door. He opened it to find Mr. Possum panting in an attempt to catch his breath. "Hello, Mr. Possum," greeted Mr. Squirrel. "Are you all right?" Just fine. I came back to ask you if you've seen anyone looking around that old house next door," explained Mr. Possum as he finally began to catch his breath. "Let me get you a tall glass of lemonade," stated Mr. Squirrel as he directed Mr. Possum to the sitting room just inside the front door. "That would be delightful," said Mr. Possum as he followed Mr. Squirrel. "Now, about next door." Mr. Possum stepped inside, adjusted his glasses, and pulled out his pencil and notebook. "Please have a seat," Mr. Squirrel offered as he poured some lemonade into a glass and handed it to Mr. Possum. Yes, thank you," Mr. Possum said as he sat down and took the glass. Then, without taking a sip, he pressed on. "Now, I really need to know, Mr. Squirrel, have you seen anyone looking around next door?" "Well, Mr. Possum, I did happen upon the late Mr. Russell Turtle's nephew," said Mr. Squirrel. Where is he?" cried Mr. Possum, jerking his head back and forth as if he expected Mr. Squirrel was hiding Mr. Turtle somewhere in his sitting room. As he looked around for clues, his notepad knocked his glass, spilling some of the lemonade. "Well, I'm not exactly sure. Here, let me clean up that little spill for you," said Mr. Squirrel as he dabbed at the lemony moisture on Mr. Possum's trousers and the sitting room floor with a cloth napkin. Yes, thank you. I'm quite fine. Sorry for the spill. Now, go on. Please go on with your story, Mr. Squirrel," urged Mr. Possum. "Oh, yes, I'm sorry. Well, I invited Mr. Turtle in for some lemonade and butter cookies, and we chatted for a bit." "So he is here! Where is he? In the restroom, maybe?" Mr. Possum rudely interrupted. "Goodness, no," Mr. Squirrel replied. "He's no longer here. He wasn't able to stay very long. He had quite a bit of business to attend to today. He left just a few minutes ago." Left? Where did he go?" the now distraught Mr. Possum blurted. "I'm not sure exactly. He did say he had a lot to do today, though," explained Mr. Squirrel. Thank you. The lemonade was wonderful," said Mr. Possum, springing to his feet and dashing out the front door. "Do drop in again sometime, Mr. Possum," Mr. Squirrel called out as Mr. Possum rushed back down Oak Street and turned the corner. "Mrs. Squirrel's lemonade tastes much better when one actually sips it, you know." I hope you'll join me next time for Chapter 7 of Thurston T. Turtle Moves to Hubbleville.